Hi there. In late November 2022, Outside Online published this article called 4 Surprising New Insights on Fueling for Endurance Sports as a part of Alex Hutchinson's Sweat Science column. I want to give a big shout out to Coach Tony Combalin for bringing it to my attention and my marketing director, John Dionisiou, for suggesting I do a review of this article because it's important that you are fully informed. So let's dive in and fill in some of the missing pieces, give another perspective, and most of all, some context. Because I've gone down the rabbit hole of fat adaptation and thus have inside knowledge, I can't help but chuckle at the first paragraph, which he quotes one of the world's leading researchers in sports nutrition, Dr. Louise Burke. And she says, "at the coal face," in quotes. Like most of today's sound bites, there's a lot missing by just quoting 3 words. Here is the full sentence. However, those at the coal face of sports nutrition can delete fat loading and high fat diets from their list of genuine ergogenic aids for conventional endurance and ultra endurance sports. This is from an editorial she wrote titled Fat Adaptation for Athletic Performance, the nail in the coffin. However, there is a fly in the ointment because Dr. Burke essentially retracted this statement roughly a decade later when the first paper to come out of the FASTER study published, and it published online. And this was Metabolic Characteristics of Keto-Adapted Ultra-Endurance Runners. Check out the title of her paper on this. Re-examining high-fat diets for sports performance. Did we call the nail in the coffin too soon? As you can see, these 3 words, at the coal face, are taken from a very strong and clear statement as if it were fact. And most people would take it as just that, a non-disputable fact coming from a credentialed expert like Dr. Burke or through somebody like Alex Hutchinson. But here, a decade later, Dr. Burke is hedging, and she should. Those 3 words yield clues to the underlying bias of this article and why it's important you think critically, analytically for yourself, and most of all, ask questions. Or you can listen to somebody like me who can't stop asking questions. So here I go. Dial up the carbs is the first key insight from this article. I'm not disagreeing with this insight per se because OFM recommends doing precisely this as part of our strategic carbohydrates concept. Where we depart is just how much, and that can vary widely. And making a point that marathoners get 85% of their in-race energy from carbohydrates is misleading, very misleading. First of all, how many of us are elite level marathoners? Second, how often as a percentage of these elites' total running volume are elite marathoners racing where they need that extra push from carbohydrates? Many of the elites actually do a majority of the volume at levels where fat is the primary energy substrate. So are you going to fuel for all of your training as if you were racing like an elite? The big problem in this is the message the author is sending is that it is all about the carbs and lots of them. This is completely out of context in the real world of training, even in the conventional high carb space. Nobody, including the elites, is racing all the time. Fat metabolism plays a much larger role than Mr. Hutchinson recognizes. Not only does it provide a significant source of energy for training and racing, it is fat metabolism that makes the magic happen. That hormesis, from the hormesis of training to build mitochondria, build capacity to get stronger, fitter, and faster. Now, ironically, by training to expand fat metabolism, You're also preparing your cardiovasculature to use those carbs at threshold levels of intensity much more efficiently. And this is because when you burn fat, the need is for twice the amount of oxygen per ATP produced versus glucose. Such training allows the body to move more oxygen, which on race day can be harnessed by massive energy via glucose as needed. Does that make sense? Okay. A great example of this was working with an Olympic gold medal swimmer who was suffering from GI issues by following that expert advice of people like Mr. Hutchinson. Now, competitive swimming is a sport where the competitions are pretty much glycolytic, no question there. Relatively short duration, super high intensity. However, the training is literally hours and hours of peering at that black line on the bottom of the pool to build the fitness and strength necessary to race competitively. And you're not going to do that glycolytically. This gal was failing to perform on keto and had GI issues and energy swings on high carb. So I worked with her, and after a couple of consultations, we addressed the GI issues, got her vitamin D up, and started to cycle her carbs in synchronized to her training demands. Now, while it was a lot more carbs in keto, it was a lot less than the conventional wisdom suggested she needed. It was actually that Goldilocks, just right amount, which allowed her to win the gold medal. And, oh yes, there was Vespa. Another significant source of glucose not mentioned is via fat metabolism. When fat adapted, your liver synthesizes glucose from fat to meet the metabolic need through a process called gluconeogenesis without catabolizing protein. Insulin from consuming too many carbs prevents this from occurring in a high carb athletes, essentially preventing them from accessing another important reservoir of glucose. This is the pathway which caused the low carb diet cohort in the FASTER study to replenish their glycogen stores without taking in any carbs instead of that carb-rich immediate post-exercise drink. Point is, fat metabolism needs to be prioritized for most of your real-world training and racing. Pareto's law of 80-20 is a good place to start. The second point they make, the second insight, is don't overdo the veggies. But before diving in, allow me to frame this topic. Dynamics is one of the key teachable points of OFM. There is an ebb and flow to everything in life. So food shifts around both in calories, macros, and types of food consumed. Heck, even a guy like Jeff Browning takes in 80 to 90% carbs in the form of gels, liquid, and honey and orange juice that's in every pouch of Vespa, that honey and orange juice, right? And he's taking in all these carbs during a 100-miler. But it only comprises less than 20% of his caloric needs. With respect to vegetables and fruits, nothing insightful here if you are doing OFM. We actually use the strategy of consuming non-starchy vegetables to fill you up and attenuate hunger in our program because they have low energy content as stated in the article. But we also move away from them prior to competition. This subject is actually well studied by the US Air Force and NASA. Just ask any SR-71 or U-2 pilot what happens if they eat a salad and go flying at high altitude. And I'm telling you, it ain't pretty. Not much different than a marathon who does the same. Of course, eliminating dead weight is always a good idea, but it's oversimplified. Getting your GI tract in optimal condition needs to be the first and underlying priority because this creates the environment for digestive flexibility so you can shift to mostly low fiber foods in the few days prior to competition where a bathroom break is not a desirable thing. And what should you be consuming when you lower your fiber intake? Yep. Energy and nutritionally dense animal-based food sources along with those strategic carbs. Not only do they contain protein, but in their natural state, plenty of fat. so you're not burning through your carb stores. What was not mentioned in the article was the subject of fat and fluid weight. When you optimize fat metabolism and prioritize fat metabolism, you burn fat instead of storing it. And you do not have that glycogen bloating of a high carb athlete whose body is dependent upon those glycogen stores, because for every molecule of glycogen stored, 4 molecules of water go with it. As our athletes know, this also can add up to several pounds of fluid weight you just don't need. The final point was titled, "Pump Up Your Iron." The author writes, she also found some key parameters to monitor on an ongoing basis: vitamin D, B12, and iron. The final point of the article was, "Pump your iron up." And the author writes, she also noted some key parameters to monitor on an ongoing basis: vitamin D, B12, and iron. Vitamin D, B12, iron deficiencies? These are insights. These insights of vitamin D, B12, and iron should never come into question, because we address them up front with OFM, so they don't need to be a problem and you don't have the stress of monitoring them. High doses of vitamin D, magnesium, and liver capsules and the protocols we have are all part of our OFM foundation pack and protocols. We use whole animal eating and fat adaptation. All of this combines to ensure you don't have to worry about these issues. That is, unless you have an underlying condition. It's simple, scientifically sound, relatively easy to execute, and prevents rather than addresses these issues. What a concept. With the popularity of plant-based diets, fear of skin cancer, and high-carb diets for athletes, this is yet another case of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And this is a cascade effect. Too much sugar in the diet. Yes, carbs are sugar as far as your body's concerned. Too little animal-based foods for bioavailable heme iron and essential B12, along with too little skin exposure or lack of vitamin D supplementation. These all impact your overall health. What's more is that when glucose is given metabolic priority in an effort to burn it off, your cells are more prone to skin cancer than they are when metabolizing fat. I could go on and on. Let's face it, I've already gone on and on enough, so I need to wrap this up. Okay, I don't need to tell you that a lot of sugar in the diet is a bad idea. You know this. Carbohydrates, however, they become glucose, blood sugar. So promulgating the consumption of a lot of carbs based on what the elite marathoners are doing in race is simply not going to end well for anyone following this advice. There are going to be a host of unintended consequences in the long haul. Connect the dots. Now, one of the problems here is this binary war going on between the high carb camp and the keto camp, and this makes it easy to promote a high carb approach for performance athletics, because for most people, they're going to simply feel terrible trying to push their performance above a certain level on keto. And then what you do is you just bring in the carbs and shazam! Of course, when you do that, high carb works, except for those unintended consequences down the track. Both camps are intransient and stuck in their version of the science. There is a better way, one that focuses on you, the individual. Like Alan Savory says, if you look at the breakthroughs in science, almost always they don't come from the center of that profession, they come from the fringe. And this is exactly where we've resided, at the very edge of human performance. We take what we learn at the very fringes of human performance to develop doable and sustainable strategies that get sustainable results for our athletes. Then we translate them to work for you. The truth is, it is not a lot of carbs any more than it is hardly any. It is an individualized and dynamic approach that can't be commoditized, and it begins with your native physiology, the one that burns fat. When carbs are your primary fuel, you will pay the price with your health, which ultimately also impacts your performance. However, when you optimize your fat metabolism and use carbs strategically when your body needs them, which is way less than you think, you will not only reach higher health and peak performance, but optimize your longevity for that ultimate endurance event we are all entered in, whether we like it or not, life.